Have you ever questioned what is included in a home inspection and why you should have one? Maybe even if you're a seller, you should still have a home inspection. I'm Adam D with the Local Connect and KW Realty, and today we're going to be talking about home inspections. Our guest today is Zach Lilienfeld. Zach is the owner of Atlantic Cape Home Inspections. He's a licensed home inspector, professional engineer, and has an MBA. He has over 39 years in building and inspection experience, along with real estate experience. Zach, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. Glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Hey, so tell us a little bit about Atlantic Cape Inspections.
Well, I started the company about 15 years ago, did a lot of rehab type work, and it sort of transitioned me into looking into doing home inspections for other people. It's been a nice ride. I've done about 5,000 inspections. The business covers Atlantic and Cape May counties. Occasionally, I'll venture out of those two counties, but most of the time, within about 10 miles of the Barrier Islands and in Cape May, that's my area.
Fantastic. So how did you get into doing home inspections? What brought you here to doing home inspections?
Well, as I mentioned a moment earlier, I was doing rehabs back in the early 2000s. I came down to the shore with my family and had an energy consulting business at the time. But I also have a civil engineering degree, and I started putting that to use doing my own home construction. I would buy houses, not many, a couple, and then had them fixed up. I kind of general contracted them. And then I realized I was learning a lot about what I didn't already know about buildings, about how they're constructed. And somehow I got the idea that it might be a nice transition to start home inspections.
Interesting.
And I also have a parallel business doing engineering. They sort of work off of each other. And that was kind of like the entree that I had into home inspections.
Yeah, knowing that, I've always found it interesting that you have that engineering background as well as being a home inspector.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can only help, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's, when you think about what a house is, it's either mechanical systems or it's structure. And my two engineering degrees cover those areas, water heating and air conditioning, foundations, framing. There's other things that I picked up along the way, of course, relating to other systems, appliances and things like that. But, the background that I got, I think, was pretty helpful in transitioning me into becoming a licensed professional engineer back in 2005.
Yeah, fantastic. So it definitely sounds like you have the background and experience to be doing home inspections, of course. Outside of all of your background and experience, do you have to carry any licenses to be a home inspector?
Just have to be licensed in this case in New Jersey. As I mentioned, there was a licensing law that went into effect in 2005. That licensing law requires me to take continuing education. It requires me to have errors and omissions insurance, and it requires me to follow procedures and regulations that cover ethics as well as knowledge. And I don't need any other licensing. The PE, the professional engineering license that I have, is not required of home inspectors. It's just an additional credential. But just being licensed is all you need to be a home inspector in New Jersey.
So Zach, moving on from there, I know that there's a lot to talk about with buyers, but I almost never hear anybody focus on sellers and sellers having a home inspection. So I'd like to drill down a little bit on having a seller, before they bring their home onto the market, having a pre-listing inspection. I know you and I have talked about this a lot, but not a lot of sellers are doing this right now. And those that are, I'm seeing have a very positive experience. So can you fill everybody in? What are we talking about with a pre-listing inspection for a seller?
Well, a pre-listing inspection, as I do them, are identical to an inspection I would do for a buyer. That will give the seller a heads up on those things that are key issues that might turn up in the future buyer's home inspection. So keep in mind that every home inspector is different in what they emphasize and their experience, knowledge, training, and education will give them. So it's not something that if you fix everything in the pre-inspection home inspection list that the guy gives you, doesn't mean that the next home inspector isn't going to find some things.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is, what you want to do is to have the time to think about what you want to fix and what you might want to just disclose. Get multiple bids from contractors for those things you do want to fix. Talk to the pre-listing home inspector that you have to find out the significance of some of the items, because some things might look bad, but they're not defects. And you want to have the home inspector in the report. In my case, I will note those things that are that look significant but really aren't. And that way, the future home inspector, when they make a big deal out of something, you can say, well, look, that crack in your structure is not structurally significant, so it doesn't need to be repaired. And that's where, in my case, it's very helpful to have an engineering degree, because I can make comments on structural issues that other home inspectors might red flag, not knowing that it isn't really significant. And so I'm sure, and I know for a fact, that people that I've done pre-listing inspections for generally have saved way more money in terms of things they had to fix when they were given the short list from their future buyer, then in other words, it was money well spent for them. My inspections, for a 3-bedroom home, if it's $500, I generally speaking will save people, multiples of that in grief and time, as well as in not having to fix things they don't have to down the road, or getting multiple bids from contractors where they can get the best price. Because the worst thing is you find out you have to fix something right after you've got your offer. You're afraid you're going to lose the deal as a seller. So you knuckle under and do the things that are being asked, only to maybe not even know that you didn't have to do those things. And still would have been able to sell the house. I have a unique perspective when I'm selling a property, that because I'm a home inspector, I can look over the other guy's home inspector report and see which things are legitimate and aren't. And I've sold a lot of homes over the years, and people didn't know, the home inspector for the buyer didn't know I was a home inspector, and they reported stuff that was ridiculous, to be honest. Roofs that were 5 years old that they said needed to be replaced, water leaks that didn't exist. As doing a pre-listing home inspection, one of the advantages is I'm the advocate of you, the seller. So I can work on your behalf to make sure you don't end up spending money you don't have to, and you don't end up fixing things you don't have to. Because not all home inspectors are created equal. Some guys are better than others. Some perhaps they were sued and now are super conservative, and they'll call everything out. And those things aren't necessarily needing to be repaired. And I can coach the seller in those cases where I'm representing the seller as the home inspector, and say, look, this is bogus. I'll talk to the other home inspector if you want me to. I'll help you with a write-up that you can dispute it. And I think that really means a lot, because people feel helpless when they're selling a house and they're given a repair list, because they might think that there are things on there that they don't have to do, but they're being compelled to do them because there's no one out there helping them to share information that might make those things unnecessary.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I know as the real estate agent involved, when somebody's hiring us to sell their home, we have many jobs, of course, but one of the things we like to focus on actually is reducing the amount of stress for a seller. It can be extremely emotional selling a home, having to make a move, and while there oftentimes there's some stress involved, we want to try and reduce that. So I know you've been involved in this before. The timeline here is, a seller often, is actually very happy. They put their house under contract. They're going to make a move. Maybe, hopefully, they see some type of windfall or paycheck from selling. And now 2 weeks later, they receive a repair request list from the buyer, and it brings on an extreme amount of stress, and they're upset, and they're angry, and they're blaming the home inspector, blaming the buyer. And it all could have been alleviated, in my opinion, in most cases, if you had the pre-listing inspection. It gives you the time to prepare. For example, as the listing agent, one of the things that we like to do is take a little bit more time than the average agent in preparing your home for photographs, for example, making sure everything looks right. That's a cosmetic detail, right? But as Zach indicated, if there is a defect with the house, you now have time to plan on if this is something that you want to repair beforehand, or not repair and disclose, but you have an estimate already of how much the repair costs. You're in control now as a seller, where my opinion is you no longer have that control once you wait it till the last minute and you have to be reactive to the buyer's inspection.
I think you hit the nail on the head. When you are under the time gun, you've lost control. Okay, the buyer now has pretty much control over what happens, the things that they're asking for, the things that they're expecting, and all you can really do is put your hands up in the air and say, "Oh, okay, here we go."
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that usually means spending money you didn't have to spend. By a simple thing, having the opportunity to have three contractors quote on a structural repair versus the contractor knowing that you are under the time gun and knowing you're not going to get any other bids for the job, and he happens to be very busy, so he's going to price your job high and then maybe not do the other guy down the street and do yours and make more money.
Yeah.
That isn't the case if you have the time to decide. First of all, you can say, I'll either fix it or I'll get a price to fix it and let you know what that is as the buyer, or but it puts you in control. I think that was the key phrase you used as the seller. And the last thing you want is for a deal to fail because there was either miscommunication or the buyer was upset because there was something they thought should be done and you weren't willing to do it because you didn't have the time to make an informed decision. So I think it almost makes it, I won't say a sure thing, but if you want to sell a house and you want to have the least amount of headaches, spending that, whatever it is, $500, $450, whatever it happens to be, and you're selling a $300,000, $400,000 house is a good investment. And as I mentioned before, I think it's, I can't think of anybody that I did an inspection like that for that didn't gain valuable knowledge that saved them way more than what they spent on me. So, in fact, I enjoy doing those, I think, even more than I do regular home inspections for buyers, because people are thrilled that they have an advocate helping them, that they have time to make decisions. They can ask questions about what's important and what isn't. And that makes everything go way smoother in the long run.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily alleviate time for us as real estate agents, but I'll admit it does make our job easier because we typically have facts to go off of. We can continue talking about this because I think it's really important. I'm not an attorney, right? But as a real estate agent, I never want to see one of my clients get sued or have a buyer take legal action against them. But what I see happen a lot is they get the home inspection and now the seller who has no experience or technical knowledge in constructing a home wants to provide to the buyer that, no, that's not a leak, or yes, it is, or there is no structural defect here. And I always get very uncomfortable when, the seller is putting, their word that whatever the home inspector said is not true. We always want that to come from a licensed professional, not the seller themselves. And you have that when you have a pre-inspection, right? In addition to that, one of the things with home inspectors that, we've talked about today is sometimes the home inspector is providing their opinion, and which is okay, but they may not be a technical expert in that particular field. So sometimes the home inspector has to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, but sometimes the home inspector has to identify an issue, but not a repair to that issue.
That's right.
Yeah. So again, as a seller, right now you have the opportunity to determine what the nature of that repair is without the added pressure.
Yeah, and also because different home inspectors have different experience levels and different understandings of various systems and components, one home inspector might call something a defect that another home inspector knows is not a defect. I know for personal experience that a home inspector told me that the windows I had in my house had failed thermal seals, meaning that the air was getting in between the twin glass panes and causing fogging, etc. Well, these windows had no fogging whatsoever. What was happening was a cosmetic issue that had to do with the window inside between the glass. It had nothing to do with the glass itself. A glass is clear perfectly and no condensation or any impairment. So it was a misstatement, which if I had to fix those windows would have cost me $6,000 or $7,000 to replace these windows. So my feedback was there is no thermal seal failure. What you see is a cosmetic issue, and I explained what thermal seal failure looks like, and the buyer of my house was like, okay. I saved $7,000. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I can help a seller do the same thing.
Yes.
Because if I do the inspection, say the windows have a cosmetic issue, and the next home inspector for the buyer says it's thermal seal failure, replace the windows, there's ammunition there to let the air out of the sails of that particular issue, and it's no longer an issue. And that's why I say, it saves a lot more money than it costs to do a pre-listing home inspection, in my opinion, based on my own experience.
I would tend to agree. Again, we don't do them as frequently as we would like, but the few times that we have, it's always been a great experience. And
it's not very popular here for some reason. Other areas of the country, very popular. So I guess maybe it's cultural. I don't know. Maybe maybe it's because it's the coastal communities, and most of these homes might be vacation homes. I don't know if that's the reason, but I've talked to other home inspectors and gone to meetings, and where half of the inspections they do are pre-listing inspections.
Wow.
With me, it's maybe 1 out of 30.
Yeah.
So there's no harm in knowing about what's going on with your house, and if you as a seller, if you proverbial stick your head in the sand, you're going to be faced with problems that that require an emergency decision. Not the way to go.
Yeah, you're going to find out eventually. I have sellers that say, "Well, I don't want to know because we're going to have to disclose it." Well, that could be true, but you're going to find out eventually when the buyer has their inspection regardless. And what I ask sellers to do is to take a step back for a minute and picture that you're a buyer. What if there's multiple homes for them to choose from, which home would you prefer? The one that has question marks surrounding it because you have no idea the condition of it, or the one that's already had an inspection and the seller's already made the significant repairs?
That's an excellent point. And what I had mentioned is that if you are a buyer and the seller says, I had a home inspector come through and I fixed all these things, and these other things I didn't have to fix, and here's why, I think the comfort level of the buyer is greatly improved, because as a home inspector, I can tell you many, many buyers suspect that sellers are either hiding something, or they don't want to know, or, unfortunately, not everybody believes in the sale of a house that everybody is upfront and on board. And if you have taken the time and effort and money to buy a service like a pre-listing inspection, it's showing that you really care about the buyers.
Yeah.
I think the buyers interpret it that way. So now, that being said, the buyer should not take that pre-listing home inspection and say, oh, okay, I don't have to have one. I can save myself $500, as the buyer. That is not going to work. A home inspection is only valid for literally the day of the inspection, because anything can happen after the home inspector leaves. A heavy rainstorm, a windstorm, a pipe leak, you rent your house out and the tenants destroy it. Anything like that can happen. And just regular routine maintenance. I've had, people say, a week after I did the inspection, their water heater started leaking. Well, or their window cracked. If I could have predicted that, I wouldn't be a home inspector. I'd be a billionaire, right? Playing the stock market. But these are I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah, I would agree. And to back that up, no inspector is perfect either.
Right.
Some inspectors are going to notice some things that a different inspector does not, and that doesn't mean that the inspector is poor because they missed something. How many components are there of a home? It's just going to happen. But as a seller, again, I would focus on how this is putting you in control again of the transaction, rather than having to be reactive to what the buyer asks of you and tells you. As we talked earlier, that it can be a difficult day sometimes when a buyer gets their home inspection report. I find the same to be true for sellers. I always reference the Febreze commercial where they say somebody's nose blind, right? That they don't notice their house stinks. Well, when they get their home inspection report, there's things in their house that they walk by every single day. They never ever noticed because it's their house. They live there. They believe everything is fine, and there may be something going on that you don't even recognize.
People get to become familiar with the problems that their house has. A couple weeks ago, I tripped on a transition between two floors, one floor was lower than the other, and they put this big fat transition strip on it. And I was going from one room to the other, and I tripped. And the seller happened to be there and said, "Oh, I see you noticed that." He goes, "We're so familiar with it, we didn't even think about it."
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
of course, that ended up in my report as a recommendation to put a
Mhm.
gradual transition in, because somebody buying a house doesn't have that foreknowledge and understanding and is going to trip, just like I did.
Yeah.
So that that's another good point.
Yeah, we get it all the time from sellers. Well, yeah, I understand the home inspector's right, but we've been doing it or using it like that for years. It's fine, you know. Um, so if you are a seller and, you know, whether you have a pre-inspection or not, at some point it's very likely your buyer is going to have a home inspection. So if you were a seller, and I guess for this purpose, let's ignore and say you didn't have a pre-listing inspection, what should you do to prepare before the buyer's home inspector shows up?
Well, that's a great question, because as a home inspector, I'm discouraged when I arrive at a house that is not ready for a home inspection. There could be valid reasons for that. If it's a tenant occupied property, you can't force the tenant to get the house ready for a home inspector. They don't really care usually. But there are things that you can do as the seller to make the home inspector's job easier, and also at the same time take a lot of guesswork out of what happens. For example, if I can't get into a crawl space because someone has a dresser sitting on top of the inside entrance to the crawl space, and I have to tell I put in my report I was unable to inspect the components in the crawl space because it was inaccessible. Well, now the buyer is going to be concerned that, well, maybe there's something in there that is really major that the seller didn't want me to see, or maybe it's in there that nobody knows about, rotting wood or termites or something like that. So what do you do as a buyer? You now feel a risk that you didn't have before.
Yep.
So you want, as a seller, to make sure everything the home inspector is going to be looking at is accessible. You want to be able to clear out anything in front of the electrical panel. You want to remove all the little glassware doodads that you have sitting on top of all the windows, so that the home inspector can open and close the windows without a cascade of glassware falling on, or candles, or window blinds that are very delicate, and as soon as anybody pulls on the cords, they come off the wall. Well, why don't you just raise all of those blinds? I don't know why people, when they are getting ready to accommodate a home inspection, will drop all of their blinds. First of all, you can't see anything when you're doing the home inspection, so you really, as a good home inspector, are going to pull all the blinds open. So open the blinds, move all of the stuff away from the front of the fireplace. A lot of people like to put a lot of doodads in front of the fireplace.
Right.
I did an inspection the other day, and they put a tray across the burners of a gas range with a fabric cover, and then they put ketchup and mustard and whatever else sitting on top of this.
Nice.
Well, I have to remove all that stuff to operate the burners, otherwise I'm going to start a fire. I've had people leave plastic ice cube trays stored in an oven, bread in bags stored in a microwave. These are things you want to get out, because obviously you don't want them destroyed, but you also don't want to make the home inspector get really super annoyed because it looks like everything that he has to do has been blocked by something you've placed there. Now, granted, there are going to be some properties you can't do anything with, pack rat properties, I call them, where people collect for years and years and years. Maybe it was an elderly parent, and now the kids are selling the house, and the place is completely chock full of stuff. Every other sentence in my home inspection report says, I was unable to inspect this because of clutter. That is not good if you're a buyer to see something like that.
Right.
Now, obviously, some of that stuff you can't get rid of, but when you're moving and you're getting ready to move out of a house, don't stack all the boxes up in front of areas that home inspectors are going to have to get to. Move the boxes in 4 or 5 feet, well, maybe 4 feet from the wall, so that it doesn't block outlets and windows and electrical panels and things like that. If there's a pull-down staircase and you have a dresser in that bedroom that would be struck by the stairs, move the dresser so the home inspector can drop the stairs and get up in the attic. If you have something padlocked, take the padlocks off. How many times have I gone to try and get into an outside shower and someone has padlocked it? and they're nowhere to be found to unlock it. What else? It's important to have all of the utilities on. Very important, especially in the wintertime. A lot of vacation homes, people, when they leave, they shut off the circuit breaker. They shut off the water. Home inspectors are not going to turn these on because they could cause a flood, an electrical fire, an explosion. These all should be on and ready to go when a home inspector arrives. So even as a real estate agent, you probably know, and most do, that you want to make sure, if you're the listing agent, that that property is ready to inspect with the utilities. Many times a home can't be inspected with the utilities on because it might be a condo in a building that winterizes their building. So you can't bring one unit back when the whole building is winterized. Right. And I understand that. Yeah. But you have to make it so that a home inspector can do their job. So as a seller and preparing for the home inspection mentally is important, but preparing physically is more important, because you don't want the home inspector to have to say at every turn, I was unable to inspect because it was blocked. So that's my advice.
Yeah, think about it. If you're a seller, at the end of the day, you want the buyer to end up showing up at the settlement table and closing on your house. So if you can do anything to make this process a little bit easier, it's typically worth it, because the buyer has already paid the home inspector to show up at your house. Now the home inspector has to go back to them and say that they couldn't, complete their inspection for any number of reasons. And now, depending upon the inspector, they may actually charge the buyer to return to re-inspect if that's asked of, of you. And who wants the inspector coming back to your house? Just make it ready for them. The one that you mentioned that we have had happen to us before is very common in this area, is the second homeowner will winterize the house and turn off the water valve to the house, and they don't, bleed the lines or winterize it properly. And then they expect the real estate agent to turn that valve on just to find out that there's a broken pipe in the house, 5 minutes before the home inspection starts. Right. And, I hate to say this, but that's why, again, have the pre-home inspection and you will alleviate having these things come up. Right.
Yep. One quick example, I did an inspection in Sea Isle City about 10 years ago. I showed up, the water was off. I was told by the seller through their real estate agent that I was given permission to turn the water on. And I reluctantly did that, but I wanted to have something on paper, so they emailed me the permission. Turns out I almost burned the house down. And you would say, why would turning a water valve cause that? Well, the homeowner had wired an outlet into the wall in the same compartment where the water valve was. So I had to drag its dresser away from the wall. I had to reach in and turn this water valve that's in a recess in the wall behind a panel. When I removed the panel to get to the valve, the wires that were in there touched because they had baked off over the course of a long period of time, and the wires were completely bare, and they touched and caused the sawdust in the wall to catch on fire.
Oh my gosh.
So, that problem was actually not the worst of it. There was other issues that went along. Everything that I wasn't supposed to do as a home inspector, I was asked to do, and every one of the things caused a bigger problem. Yeah. So bottom line, the house never sold. And however, the seller was thrilled that I discovered these things, because I saved his house actually from burning down, because someone else would have caused that. Other than me, and it probably would have been worse. So, that being said, if the house was ready, nobody would have had to turn a water valve on. Now, that the buyer was happy because I found these things, and they said, geez, these are not items you would have normally discovered. And I said, that's absolutely right. Things that were defective, I never would have reached into the wall because I wouldn't have had to. So, in that case, there was a silver lining. I helped the seller because his house didn't burn down. And the buyer ended up with a property that they liked better than the first one. And they used the same agent because the agent was very, very good to them. So it worked out for everybody. But I just have to say, have the place ready. Utilities on in particular. If you are the seller and it's your second home and you have this penchant for turning a water valve off when you leave, remember, if your house is going to be inspected, you better turn that valve back on again.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the report's going to say I was unable to inspect the house because there was no running water, and that's not a good deal.
Yeah.
So.
And if you're a seller, don't be concerned by what we're saying here. You're going to have advance notice before the home inspection. This isn't something that's typically going to happen, with a day's notice. You're typically going to have a few days notice.
Right.
And it's best for everybody to make sure things are ready to go when the inspector gets there.
Sure.
Zach, before we wrap up here, I have one more thing on my list. If the seller does not choose to have a pre-listing inspection, they get the buyer's inspection report back, and they don't agree with some of the defects that the buyer's inspector found, what are their best options? What would you advise them to do?
Well, that's a good point. And what I would say is that if you can get an independent person to come in to dispute those things, you have a better chance of the buyer understanding why you're not going to fix it. Obviously, if you're doing a pre-listing inspection, I'm that advocate. But otherwise, you're sort of stuck. If you go to a contractor to say, does this really need to be fixed? The contractor, they have skin in the game. They're seeing dollar signs. So they're going to say, yeah, it does. And so, not everyone, but there is a bias there to repair versus say it's not necessary. So
sure.
I guess probably the only thing is to hire a home inspector to be your advocate. I've done that on a couple of occasions. I charge, generally speaking, in my case, about $150 an hour is what I've been doing, and I'll give people an hour of my time. Maybe less or more if they want me to show up, or if they just want to send me the document, the home inspector's report. Sometimes I need to actually physically look at what it is. There might not be a picture, or the picture might not be clear enough for me to tell whether it's legitimate or not. But it's a cost benefit situation. If it's worth it to spend a small amount of money to save a lot of money, and I've saved people a ton of money, especially out of my engineering business, who were told they needed structural repairs. In one case, $40,000 of structural repairs that really was zero. Yeah. Because the company that was recommending it was a basement waterproofing company, not a structural engineer. And he stood to make money off of that to the tune of $40,000. So if you pay someone $500 to save $40,000, that's a good deal. So it might be worth it to ask your home inspector if they're willing to look over this other home inspector to look over another home inspector's report, maybe come out and take a look, because it might be worth it, especially if the dollars are big enough. And if you believe as the homeowner that what's being asked for is unreasonable. And that's the key. It has to be reasonable. You don't want to expect as a buyer that somebody's going to rebuild their house for you, a house that they've lived in for 50 years. So you have to be reasonable, and that's really where the home inspector can come in. It can separate reason from wish list.
Yeah, I would tend to agree on everything you said there. If you are a seller, it is okay to get a specialist in to, check on issues, whether if it's a plumbing issue, then a licensed plumber, for example. And if you want to go the route of a home inspector, that's just as good. And I like to remind sellers too that, the buyer's home inspector typically isn't trying to be intentional. Even if they are wrong, they're typically not intentional in doing that. It may have been an error or an oversight. And we see it happen all of the time where that happens. So having that second opinion is helpful, like most things in life. Zach, with that said, I think we've done a really deep dive into home inspections here. This is probably going to be the, best resource online overall on home inspections. Anything that we forgot to cover?
Well, if there is, I don't remember. I can't think of it now, but I guess, it takes all kinds. I can say everybody has their own threshold of pain when it comes to buying a house. Things that they don't care about and things that they really care about, and everybody's different. And as a home inspector, I have to be cognizant that there are a lot of parties involved, and everybody has, at some point an agenda, and I have to be independent. I have to be able to share an opinion, not be influenced by the buyer. Oftentimes, buyers want something. They want the home inspector to report it. It's a cosmetic item, not a defect. It's not even a maintenance item, but it's something that the buyer wants. And you have to be able to tactfully explain to people what the home inspection is for and what it isn't for, and set the right expectations. And I think explaining things the right way without, reports that have words like hazard and danger and things, unless they are absolutely hazardous and dangerous, you got to be able to explain things without scaring people, but giving them the right knowledge so they can make intelligent decisions. And I think that's what you need to look for whenever you hire someone as a home inspector or termite inspector or whatever, that they need to be independent, and they need to be able to explain things so that you understand them and not scare you. And I guess that, that's pretty much it,
Yeah. Yeah, good stuff. So, Zach, with that said, if somebody wanted to get a hold of you or hire you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Well, probably emailing me. My email, which I guess you might have the email address to add, but it's my company name, atlanticcape.com, spelled like Atlantic and Cape may run together with one C. So it's atlanticcape.com. And, provide me information that I can get back to you on, your contact information, maybe a tiny little bit about the house. That's one way. You can also call me at 609-431-0202, which is my home inspection phone number. And I just dropped my phone, by the way. So that's another way to get a hold of me. And I'm out there. If I'm doing an inspection, I may not answer right away, so leave a voicemail. I try to accommodate my clients' needs and time schedule when possible. But if you can be flexible, you're more than likely going to get a good inspector. And I think that, contacting an inspector early enough in the process gets them thinking about when they can schedule you. And then ultimately, when you pick a date and time, try to stick with it, not move it around if you can help it. And then we're going to do a good job as home inspectors for you.
Awesome. Great job. So if you didn't catch Zach's contact information, we'll make sure that wherever this video is being hosted, that we'll have your phone number and email address directly below it so people can get a hold of you. And Zach, truly appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's been super helpful, I think, to anybody who's either buying or selling a home.
My pleasure. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Take care.